Hello and welcome to a lesson in social and cultural factors. We're looking at the pre-industrial era, so between the 1700s and coming up towards the 1850s. Ultimately, what's the syllabus asking you to know? You need to be able to understand the different factors, the social and cultural factors, and how they shaped the characteristics and the participation of sport. You need to be able to know what is meant by popular recreation, so that key term, popular recreation, and ultimately be able to identify the key characteristics of popular recreation during this period of time within Britain. Okay, so let's look at this first term, popular recreation. So ultimately what you need to be able to understand is this word refers to the sport and pastimes of people in the pre-industrial Britain. So between the 1700s and around about the 1820s, 1830s, people that played sport or did various activities, it would have been referred to as popular recreation. And often sport is seen to reflect society of our times. So obviously, as you'll see from the different characteristics of sports during this period, it often reflected how society looked like. So the first picture and diagram to help you set the scene is thinking what England used to look like during the 1700s, the 1750s and so on, this pre-industrialization. So often the country would have been very rural. Population would have been spread out. Okay, so we had very few towns at this stage and big cities as we do today. So we'd have had lots of countryside, lots of agriculture, lots of farming and so on. Within this system, we had a two-tier society. So we had an upper class, the gentry, and we had the lower class, the peasants. And ultimately, life in general, especially for the lower class, which would have been the majority of the population, conditions would have been harsh. They'd often been quite violent, as we'll see as to why that was the case a little bit later. And often life was cruel. So we had examples of disease that used to be quite rife, and poor living conditions ultimately. Whereas the opposite would have been said for the few, the upper class. They would have lived in luxury, stately homes and so on, and would have been able to afford the luxuries of life. And finally, the key point there at the bottom is about the fact that we had limited free time. So although we had all of this space and this land, the lower class would have been working on farmland, on the agricultural seasons, and often they would have been working long hours, and that had a big impact on the type of sport that was played as well. Okay, so let's look at the first social factor. We look at kind of like social class. Ultimately here we need to know that we've got, as I said before, the two class systems with the gentry, the upper class, and the lower class, which we refer to as the peasants. And it's worth making a note that in terms of the types of sports and activities that were played, the upper class would have played things like mob football, prize fighting, pedestrianism, which is kind of speed walking, but often those sports would have been played by many. If you look at mob football in particular, talking about 100 to 500 people may have taken part in that event alone. Would have been often chaotic, hostile, and violent. Whereas the gentry class, the upper class, would have been playing in sports that required things like horses. So often things like fox hunting. They would have needed sophisticated equipment, so for things like real tennis, cricket, and there would have been some military influence there as well. They would have taken part in things like archery. They'd have also taken part in activities that weren't illegal at the time, but things like animal baiting, so cockfighting, for example. And you would have also seen the upper class, as you looked back on your previous lesson in some of the pictures, of the upper class being patrons. And what we mean by that is that they were the agents. They were kind of the key sponsors for some of these peasants. And ultimately they would have owned the peasants and they would have taken them to these various events. Okay, so how did that have an impact in terms of sport? So often, as I said before, the different classes took part in different activities, and ultimately they had different positions and roles in society. So the social classes were affected by things like time, money, education, and transport. And ultimately that therefore kind of impacted and reflected on the type of activities that they played. So the lower class, the peasants would have played things like simple, violent and very limited rules in terms of the sports and activities that they played. All right, so let's move on to gender. So here within this era, this period of time, gender, there was a big gender equality or lack of gender equality, should I say. And we had the weaker class or the weaker sex being referred to as women. So often they would stay at home. The expectation was that they would fulfill that household roles, things like cooking, cleaning, raising children, and so on. So again, pause your video here and think about how did this have an impact on the activities that would have been played in society. Okay, so if women were at home, ultimately that meant that they participated very little in sports. So ultimately a lot of this popular recreation would have been male dominated. And as it was male dominated, these sports would have been more aggressive, more hostile, and more violent ultimately. Different genders took part in different activities. So, I mean, some women would have taken part in some popular recreation, but very little. And often the sports that they would have taken part in would have been non-aggressive and non-competitive. Ultimately, that meant that women had less time because if they were at home cooking, cleaning, raising their children and so on, they wouldn't have had time to play much of these different sports. Okay, let's move on to law and order next. Ultimately, if we look at the top right, first of all, we had minimal law and order in society. We had a lack of police force to enforce those rules. So that's what I mean by this society being harsh, being cruel and being violent. Police wasn't created until 1829. So ultimately, it was a bit of a dog-eat-dog world up until that point. And ultimately, that meant that it had an impact on sport and the different activities because ultimately sport had limited rules. We live in a society now where we obviously have law and order enforced upon us, but ultimately that meant that the activities that were played would have been harsh, would have been cruel, and there would have been a lot of violent conduct. It also meant that rules were localized, so they would have stayed in their local area. So if we played mob football down the south, okay, it would have maybe looked very different in comparison to up north or other parts of the country, and that meant the rules were quite localized. And as I said, nothing was illegal, so ultimately we could have been doing things like gambling, animal cruelty, all of that would have been accepted in society because we had no law enforcement. We move on to education and literacy next. So here we're looking at the upper class. They were the ones that were educated, they were the ones that could read and write, okay, whereas the working class and females for that matter would have been illiterate, so they wouldn't have been able to read and write. Again, pause your video here. How did this have an impact on the sport and activities that were played between the two classes? Okay, so hopefully you've got down things like the fact that the working class, the fact they couldn't read and write, ultimately they played sport with limited rules and often quite simple sports because ultimately they couldn't read and write, so they couldn't write any rules down. This would have been opposite for the upper classes. Okay, so they would have often played some more sophisticated sports, so things like cricket, things like tennis, that required rules to be written down. We move on to transport next. Again, here we're talking about the fact that during this era we had poor road conditions. We had horse and cart as the main form of transport. Lower classes wouldn't have had access to horses. They wouldn't have owned any horses. So ultimately they had to walk to different parts of where they wanted to go. That's why they stayed quite local. Again, pause the video here. How does this have an impact on the types of activities played within society? Okay, so hopefully you've got down the fact that lower classes often had to play locally, so they couldn't formulate any kind of competitions, any leagues, because ultimately they played just within their local area. They didn't have access to go to other parts of the country. That meant that the lower class sports didn't have standardized rules, so as I said before, they would have differed from place to place in regards to how they played. Okay, so one village may have played mob football with an actual football, whereas another village may have played with a barrel of beer to try and get back to one village and then drink that barrel of beer once they got it there. Okay, but the principles would have been the same, but there also been different forms of excuse me, different forms of rules a little bit there. It says many upper class built sports facilities at home to avoid travel on poor roads. Okay, so that's why we saw things like tennis courts and lawn tennis courts at the back of people's gardens, or in these stately homes would have had different festivals. But if they did have to travel, then this formed the basis of some sports as well. Look at availability of time next, or of money, should I say, sorry. We've got the fact that lower classes lived off the land, the upper classes had a higher disposable income. So you can see here, I'm going to get you to watch this eventually, but ultimately you've got the working class, or the peasants, would have been on the left-hand side of this diagram. On the right-hand side, we've got the gentry class, which would have had the stately homes and the land. Again, how does this have an impact on sport and the different activities played in society? Pause your video here. Okay, so hopefully you've mentioned things like the fact that upper classes could afford that expensive equipment, that specialised facilities, or transport to get them to the various events. Okay, the lower classes, complete and utter opposite. They had to use natural facilities, so localised fields and areas that they had close to them, and obviously the equipment would have been very limited as well. We move on to availability of time. Okay, so the lower classes often had to work very long hours, so up to 75 hours a week, so on the weekends as well. The upper classes had a lot of free time. So, you know, the lower classes, when they did compete and did play their particular sports, a lot of this would have been around the time of the church and significant religious events where there would have been holiday time. Okay, so things like Easter time and so on. So again, pause your video here. How does this have an impact on the sport and activities in society? Okay, so things you could have mentioned here, obviously the lower classes had little time to participate. This was due to the long hours that they were working, and had very little energy. It's very, you know, we forget that, don't we, in terms of they're working hard on their farmland, but ultimately they've got very little energy to actually play as well. And they could only participate, like I said, on bank holidays, on religious events, often dictated sort of by the religious calendar that we had within England at the time. And some of these activities would have been very short as well, as it says there. Okay, so exam station. I just want you to look at the next two questions here. Pause the video here, see if you can answer them to start with. Okay, now try and do the same for these two questions here, for question 3 and question 4. Pause the video again, and then we're going to go through each answer. Okay, so let's look at the first question. So explain 2 ways that the availability of time affected participation in pre-industrial sport. Things you could have got down here, obviously this question is worth 2 marks. You could have talked about the lower classes often working long hours, so they had limited time to participate. You could have talked about the festivals, so as I mentioned before, the holy days, the different wakes and fairs that gave the lower classes the opportunities to participate during these particular periods of time. You could have mentioned about the upper class, about the fact that they had extended free time, so often they were able to participate more often. And as the last bullet point says, extensive free time, so they can participate for long-lasting activities such as fox hunting, which could have gone on for hours. Okay, question 2. So using examples, describe 2 ways in which social classes influenced the characteristics of sport and the pastime in pre-industrialised Britain. Okay, so these are some of the points that you could have got down. Different classes took part in different activities, and often the lower classes played in things like mob football, upper classes, as we said, about playing in real tennis. You could have mentioned about the fact that different classes may have had different roles in their games and different pastimes. So again, you could sort of explain that in a little bit more detail, and you can just keep on going through the bullet points, okay, to help you. Same with question 3, just look at the mark scheme, pause the video here, see what you've got, see what you could have included, but obviously make sure you've got clearly 5 social factors. And finally, question 4, describe 2 ways in which education and literacy affected participation in sport in pre-industrialised Britain. Again, pause the video here. You could have mentioned things like unwritten rules, okay, often associated with things like mob football. Simple rules would have been for lower class and peasant class, whereas the upper class had more advanced rules, and you could have given examples such as real tennis. Best of luck, folks.